The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as 9-year-old Princess Charlotte walked slowly down the marble corridor. Her small shoes made soft clicking sounds that echoed in the vast hallway. Today was different from other days. Today she felt a heavy sadness in her chest that she couldn't quite understand. Charlotte had always been known for her bright smile and cheerful nature. The palace staff often commented on how she brought light wherever she went. But this morning her usual sparkle was missing. She had overheard something the night before that made her heart feel heavy. Her parents, Prince William and Catherine, had been talking in hushed voices about changes coming to their family's life. The young princess didn't understand all the grown-up words, but she caught phrases like more responsibilities and less time together and the weight of the crown. These words scared her. Would her family change? Would her papa become too busy for their evening walks in the garden? Would her mama stop reading bedtime stories? As Charlotte walked past the portraits of her ancestors lining the walls, she felt smaller than usual. These serious-looking people in fancy clothes seemed to be watching her, reminding her of the future that awaited her. She was third in line to the throne, something adults always mentioned when they met her. But what did that really mean for a 9-year-old who just wanted to play with her brothers and spend time with her family? The palace felt unusually quiet that morning. The usual bustle of staff preparing for the day seemed muted. Charlotte's footsteps led her toward the garden entrance, where she often found peace among the flowers her great-grandmother had loved so much. Queen Elizabeth had passed away not long ago, and Charlotte still missed her terribly. The Queen had always made time for her, always listened to her stories, and never made her feel like being a princess was a burden. Standing at the garden door, Charlotte pressed her small hand against the cool glass. Outside she could see the royal guards in their traditional red uniforms standing at their posts. They stood so still, so serious, always watching and protecting. She had often wondered what it would be like to talk to them, but protocol dictated that they maintain their professional distance. They were there to protect, not to comfort. The weight of being a princess suddenly felt too heavy for her young shoulders. All the lessons about proper behavior, the constant reminders about setting a good example, the photographers always trying to take her picture. It all seemed overwhelming. She just wanted to be a normal little girl sometimes, to make mistakes without everyone watching, to cry without it being improper. As tears began to form in her eyes, Charlotte realized she had never felt this alone before, even surrounded by all the people whose job it was to care for her and her family. The palace was full of people, but none of them seemed to understand how she felt. They all treated her with such careful respect that sometimes she felt like a delicate ornament rather than a real person with real feelings. The morning stretched ahead of her with lessons and obligations, but all Charlotte wanted was someone who would simply listen to her worries without trying to fix them or explain them away. Someone who would see her as just Charlotte, not Princess Charlotte. Someone who might understand that even princesses sometimes felt scared and lonely. Standing there in the quiet corridor, with sunlight streaming around her and the weight of centuries of royal tradition pressing down on her small frame, Princess Charlotte had never felt more in need of a friend. Little did she know that sometimes friendship and understanding could come from the most unexpected places, and that breaking protocol might be exactly what her heart needed. The tears Charlotte had been holding back finally spilled over as she stood in the palace corridor. They rolled down her cheeks silently at first, but then her shoulders began to shake with quiet sobs. She had tried so hard to be brave, to be the perfect princess everyone expected her to be, but today the sadness felt too big to contain. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, remembering her governess's lessons about proper behavior. Princesses must always maintain composure in public, she had been taught, but these tears felt different. They came from a place deep inside her that lessons couldn't reach. They were tears of confusion, of loneliness, and of a childhood that sometimes felt too complicated. Charlotte's mind wandered to her brothers, Prince George and Prince Louis. George, being older and the future king, seemed to handle the pressure better. He appeared to understand his role and accept it with a maturity that Charlotte envied. Louis, being younger, still lived mostly free from the weight of royal expectations. He could laugh loudly, run wildly, and be messy without anyone worrying about protocol. Charlotte felt caught between them, old enough to understand the responsibilities, but young enough to still want the freedom of childhood. The palace around her felt like a beautiful prison. Every room was magnificent, filled with priceless artwork and furniture that had been there for centuries. But Charlotte couldn't touch most things, couldn't run in the halls, couldn't shout when she was excited. Even her play had to be supervised and appropriate. Sometimes she dreamed of living in a normal house where she could jump on the furniture and eat cookies in bed without anyone caring about crumbs on silk sheets. As her tears continued to fall, Charlotte heard footsteps approaching from down the corridor. Panic filled her chest. She couldn't let anyone see her crying. What would they think? What would they tell her parents? She quickly tried to wipe her face, but the tears kept coming. Her breath became shaky as she realized she couldn't stop crying before whoever was approaching would see her. The footsteps grew closer, and Charlotte felt trapped. She looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the grand corridor offered little privacy. The portraits on the wall seemed to frown down at her disapprovingly. She imagined her ancestors whispering about the princess who couldn't control her emotions, who wasn't strong enough for royal life. Her heart pounded as the footsteps came nearer. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping somehow to become invisible. The morning light streaming through the window seemed too bright, making her feel exposed and vulnerable. Everything about her situation felt impossible. She couldn't run away because that wouldn't be proper. She couldn't explain her tears because she wasn't even sure she understood them herself. The sound of her own crying seemed too loud in the quiet corridor. Charlotte covered her mouth with her hands, trying to muffle the sobs, but it only made her feel more desperate. She closed her eyes tightly, wishing she could disappear or wake up from what felt like a bad dream. When she opened them again, she saw a pair of polished black boots stopped right in front of her. Slowly, Charlotte lifted her tear-stained face to see who had found her in this moment of vulnerability. Standing before her was one of the royal guards, a tall man in his pristine red uniform. His expression was hidden beneath the shadow of his ceremonial hat, but something in his posture seemed different from the usual rigid stance of the guards. There was a gentleness there that she had never noticed before. The guard stood silently for a moment, taking in the sight of the young princess in distress. Charlotte waited for him to walk away or to summon help, as protocol would dictate. Guards weren't supposed to interact with the royal family beyond their protective duties. But instead of moving on, he remained there, creating a protective presence that somehow made Charlotte feel less alone in her sadness. The guard's name was Thomas, though Princess Charlotte didn't know that yet. He had been working at the palace for 8 years, ever since Charlotte was a baby. Over the years, he had watched the royal children grow, always from a respectful distance. He had seen their first steps, heard their laughter echoing through the halls, and witnessed their small triumphs and disappointments. Though he never spoke to them directly, he felt a protective affection for all 3 children. Thomas had daughters of his own at home, twins who were close to Charlotte's age. When he looked at the crying princess, he didn't see royalty first. He saw a little girl who was hurting, and every parental instinct in his body told him to help. His training said to maintain distance, to alert proper authorities, to follow protocol. But his heart said something entirely different. Standing there in his perfectly pressed uniform, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. Very slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a clean white handkerchief. It was nothing fancy, just a simple piece of cloth that his wife had ironed for him that morning. Without saying a word, he held it out toward Charlotte, bending slightly so he wasn't towering over her. Charlotte looked at the handkerchief with surprise. No guard had ever offered her anything before. They weren't supposed to. She glanced up at Thomas's face, trying to read his expression beneath the shadow of his hat. What she saw there wasn't the blank, professional look she was used to from palace staff. Instead, she saw kindness and genuine concern. It was the same look her papa gave her when she had nightmares. With trembling hands, Charlotte accepted the handkerchief. It was soft and smelled faintly of lavender, probably from the laundry soap his wife used. As she dabbed at her tears, she felt a small comfort in this simple act of kindness. No one had told Thomas what to do or how to help her. He had simply seen that she needed something and provided it. Thomas knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Charlotte's eye level. This was completely against protocol. Guards were never supposed to kneel before anyone except the monarch, and certainly never supposed to abandon their posts for personal interactions. But as he looked into Charlotte's sad eyes, protocol seemed much less important than compassion. "Are you all right, Your Highness?" he asked softly, his voice gentle and warm. It was the first time Charlotte could remember a guard speaking directly to her outside of formal greetings. His accent was different from the tutors and staff she usually heard. It was working-class London, honest and straightforward. Charlotte hiccuped slightly, still holding the handkerchief to her face. She wanted to say she was fine, the way she had been taught to respond when people asked about her well-being. But something about Thomas's genuine concern made her want to tell the truth instead. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice small and uncertain. "Everything feels too big today." "Too scary." Thomas nodded as if he understood completely. He didn't try to tell her she shouldn't feel that way or that everything would be fine. He didn't recite proper responses about royal duty and privilege. Instead, he simply acknowledged her feelings as valid and real. "Sometimes the world can feel very big," he agreed quietly, "even for brave princesses." The simple validation of her feelings made Charlotte's eyes fill with fresh tears. But these felt different somehow. They weren't tears of loneliness anymore. They were tears of relief at being understood. For the first time that morning, she didn't feel completely alone with her worries. Other staff members occasionally passed by in the distance, but Thomas positioned himself in a way that shielded Charlotte from view. He was breaking multiple rules by engaging with her like this, but something told him this moment was more important than regulations. Sometimes, he thought, being human mattered more than following orders. Thomas looked around the corridor carefully, making sure they had privacy. He knew that what he was about to do could cost him his job, but seeing Charlotte's distress made the risk seem worthwhile. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules, and his heart told him this was one of those times. "Would you like to sit down for a moment?" Thomas asked gently, gesturing toward a small alcove with a window seat that was partially hidden from the main corridor. It wasn't completely private, but it would give them a few minutes to talk without being immediately noticed. Charlotte nodded, grateful for the suggestion. Her legs felt shaky from crying, and the idea of sitting somewhere quiet appealed to her. They moved to the alcove together, and Charlotte settled onto the cushioned window seat while Thomas remained standing nearby, still alert to his surroundings but focused on her. "I have 2 daughters about your age," Thomas said softly, surprising Charlotte. She had never thought about the guards having families of their own. To her, they had always seemed like part of the palace itself, permanent fixtures without lives beyond these walls. "Really?" Charlotte asked, her curiosity momentarily overriding her sadness. "What are their names?" "Emma and Sophie," Thomas replied with a smile that Charlotte could hear in his voice even though she couldn't see his full face clearly. "They're twins and they're 9, just like you. They worry about big things sometimes, too." This revelation fascinated Charlotte. The idea that other children her age had worries made her feel less alone. "What do they worry about?" she asked quietly. Thomas thought for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Emma worries about doing well in school and making her teachers proud. Sophie worries about fitting in with her friends and whether people really like her. Different worries than yours, perhaps, but just as real and important to them." Charlotte considered this. She had never thought about how other children might have their own versions of the pressures she felt. In her world, so much attention was focused on her unique situation as a princess that she sometimes forgot other children face challenges too. "Do you help them when they're scared?" Charlotte asked. "I try to," Thomas replied honestly. "Sometimes I can fix their problems and sometimes I can't, but I always listen to them. I think that's the most important thing adults can do for children. Really listen and take their feelings seriously." This was exactly what Charlotte had been craving without knowing how to ask for it. So many adults in her life tried to solve her problems or explain them away, instead of simply acknowledging that she had a right to feel upset sometimes. "I heard my parents talking about changes coming," Charlotte admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand everything they said, but it sounded scary. Like everything might be different." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. He couldn't know the specific details of what the royal family was discussing, but he understood change was difficult for children, especially when they didn't fully understand what was happening. "Change can be frightening," he acknowledged, "even when it might be good change. Not knowing what's coming next is one of the hardest things for people to handle, especially children." Charlotte felt tears starting again, but they were softer now, more manageable. "I don't want things to change," she said. "I like how our family is now. I like our evening walks and story time and Sunday morning pancakes. What if all that goes away?" Thomas felt his heart ache for this little girl who carried such adult worries. He wished he could promise her that nothing would change, but He knew that wouldn't be honest or helpful. Instead, he chose to offer her something more valuable than false reassurance. "The love in your family won't change," he said with quiet certainty. "The important things, the way your parents care about you, the way your brothers make you laugh, the special moments you share, those things live in your hearts, not in schedules or routines. Even if some things about your daily life change, the love stays the same." Charlotte looked up at him with wonder. This guard, this man she had never really spoken to before, seemed to understand something that had been worrying her for weeks. Maybe she thought she wasn't as alone as she had believed. As Charlotte and Thomas continued their quiet conversation, neither of them noticed the soft footsteps approaching from the opposite end of the corridor. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had been looking for her daughter after discovering she wasn't in her room for morning lessons. She had expected to find Charlotte in the library or perhaps the garden, but hearing voices from the alcove made her pause. What Catherine saw took her by surprise. There was her daughter, tears still visible on her cheeks, sitting comfortably in conversation with one of the guards who was clearly supposed to be at his post. Her first instinct was concern about protocol being broken. But something about the scene made her stop and listen rather than immediately intervene. She could hear Thomas speaking gently to Charlotte about feelings and family, his voice full of warmth and understanding. She watched as Charlotte responded with more openness than she had shown in weeks. The little girl who had been withdrawn and quiet lately was actually talking about her worries, something Catherine had been trying unsuccessfully to encourage. Catherine felt a mix of emotions. As a mother, she was grateful that someone was comforting her distressed child. As a royal, she was aware that this interaction was highly irregular and could create complications. As a person, she was moved by the genuine kindness she was witnessing. Thomas was sharing a story about his own daughters and how they had handled a difficult change when they moved to a new neighborhood. Emma cried for 3 days, he was telling Charlotte. She was convinced she would never make new friends and that everything would be terrible. "But you know what happened?" "What?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious. She discovered that the little girl next door loved the same book she did. Within a week, they were inseparable. Sometimes the changes we fear the most lead us to wonderful new experiences we never could have imagined. Catherine listened to this exchange with growing appreciation for Thomas's gentle wisdom. He wasn't giving Charlotte empty platitudes or royal appropriate responses. He was sharing real stories and honest emotions in a way that clearly resonated with her daughter. Deciding that this conversation was more valuable than protocol, Catherine stepped back and waited. She would speak with Thomas later about the irregularities, but right now, Charlotte was getting exactly what she needed. Genuine understanding from someone who saw her as a child first and a princess second. From her hiding spot, Catherine heard Charlotte ask, "But what if I'm not brave enough for all the changes? What if I can't be the kind of princess everyone expects me to be?" This question made Catherine's heart ache. She had been so focused on preparing Charlotte for her future role that she hadn't fully considered how overwhelming those expectations might feel to a 9-year-old. Hearing her daughter's fear spoken aloud was both heartbreaking and enlightening. Thomas was quiet for a moment before responding. "Can I tell you a secret about bravery?" he asked Charlotte. "Yes, please," Charlotte replied eagerly. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and doing what needs to be done anyway. And you know what else? Nobody expects you to be brave all by yourself. That's what families are for, and friends, and sometimes even guards who care about you. You don't have to carry everything alone." Catherine felt tears prick her own eyes at this beautiful explanation. This guard understood something fundamental about childhood that sometimes got lost in royal protocols and preparations. Children needed to know they weren't alone, that asking for help was okay, and that being scared didn't make them failures. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, absorbing this wisdom. Then she said something that made both Thomas and Catherine smile. "I think you must be a very good papa to Emma and Sophie." "I try to be," Thomas replied humbly. "Just like your parents try to be good to you. Sometimes adults make mistakes because we worry so much about doing everything right that we forget to simply listen to what children need." Catherine realized that Thomas had just given her valuable insight into her own parenting. In her efforts to prepare Charlotte for royal life, she might have forgotten to address Charlotte's immediate emotional needs. The conversation she was overhearing was a gentle reminder that even future queens were still little girls who needed comfort and understanding. After listening for several more minutes, Catherine decided it was time to make her presence known. She approached the alcove slowly, giving Thomas time to notice her before she spoke. When he saw her, his face immediately showed concern about being caught away from his post and engaging with Charlotte inappropriately. Thomas quickly stood at attention, his professional demeanor returning instantly. "Your Royal Highness," he said formally, "I apologize for leaving my post. Princess Charlotte was in distress and Catherine held up a gentle hand to stop his explanation. "Please don't apologize," she said softly, looking between Thomas and her daughter. "What I witnessed was exactly what Charlotte needed. Sometimes the most important protocols are the human ones." Charlotte looked surprised to see her mother, and a brief flash of worry crossed her face. She wondered if Thomas would get in trouble because of her. "Mama, I was crying and Thomas helped me feel better. Please don't be angry with him." The protective way Charlotte spoke about Thomas touched Catherine deeply. It showed that in just a short conversation, this guard had earned her daughter's trust and loyalty. That was no small feat with a child who had been taught to be cautious around people. "I'm not angry, sweetheart," Catherine assured Charlotte, sitting down beside her on the window seat. "I'm grateful to Thomas for taking such good care of you." She looked up at the guard with genuine appreciation. "Thank you for comforting my daughter. What you did today was more important than any protocol." Thomas seemed surprised by the positive response. "I have daughters of my own, Your Highness. When I saw Princess Charlotte upset, I couldn't simply walk by. I hope I didn't overstep too badly." "You stepped exactly where you needed to," Catherine replied firmly. "Charlotte has been struggling with some worries lately, and I haven't been able to help her open up about them. Somehow you managed to do in 20 minutes what I've been trying to accomplish for weeks." Charlotte looked at her mother with interest. "You knew I was worried about things?" "I could see it, darling," Catherine said, smoothing Charlotte's hair. "But I wasn't sure how to help you talk about it. Sometimes when we love someone so much, we want to fix their problems so badly that we forget to simply listen first." This honest admission from her mother surprised Charlotte. She had assumed her parents always knew exactly what to do and say. Learning that her mother sometimes felt uncertain too made Charlotte feel less alone in her confusion. Thomas shifted slightly, still uncomfortable with the irregularity of the situation. "Perhaps I should return to my duties now," he suggested. "In a moment," Catherine said. "First, I'd like to know if this conversation helped Charlotte feel better about her worries." Charlotte nodded enthusiastically. "Thomas told me that being scared doesn't mean I'm not brave, and that I don't have to handle everything by myself. He said the love in our family won't change even if other things do." Catherine smiled at Thomas with genuine warmth. "That's exactly what she needed to hear, and I suspect she heard it more clearly from you than she might have from me right now. Sometimes children need to hear important truths from unexpected sources." "Will Thomas get in trouble for helping me?" Charlotte asked, concern evident in her voice. Catherine considered this question carefully. Technically, Thomas had broken several rules by leaving his post and engaging personally with a member of the royal family. But the outcome had been so positive that punishing him seemed not only wrong but counterproductive. "No, sweetheart," Catherine said decisively. "Thomas will not get in trouble. In fact, I think what happened here today shows us that sometimes the most important rules are about kindness and compassion, not about staying in designated positions." Thomas looked relieved and grateful. "Thank you, Your Highness. That means more than you know." Catherine stood up and extended her hand to Thomas in a gesture that was both formal and personal. "No, Thomas. Thank you. You reminded us today that taking care of each other is more important than following every protocol perfectly. That's a lesson worth remembering." As Thomas shook her hand, Charlotte felt a warm feeling spreading through her chest. The sadness that had felt so overwhelming that morning was still there, but it felt manageable now. She had learned that she wasn't alone with her worries, that asking for help was okay, and that kindness could come from unexpected places. In the weeks that followed that meaningful morning, subtle but important changes began to take place throughout the palace. Catherine had a long conversation with Prince William about what she had witnessed, and together they realized they needed to adjust their approach to preparing Charlotte for her future role. They began scheduling regular one-on-one time with each of their children, focusing on listening rather than instructing. Thomas returned to his regular duties, but something had shifted in the atmosphere around him. Word of his compassionate interaction with Princess Charlotte had spread quietly through the staff, not as gossip, but as an example of what it truly meant to serve the royal family. He wasn't reprimanded or transferred. Instead, his superiors recognized that he had demonstrated the highest form of service by putting human needs before rigid protocols. Charlotte found herself looking for Thomas during her daily walks through the palace corridors. When their eyes met, he would give her a subtle nod and a warm smile that reminded her she had a friend among the staff. These small acknowledgments meant more to her than grand gestures could have. They reminded her that she was seen and cared for as a person, not just as a royal figure. A few weeks later, Catherine arranged for Thomas's daughters, Emma and Sophie, to visit the palace with their father for a special tour. It was unusual for staff to bring their families to work, but Catherine felt it was important for Charlotte to meet the girls Thomas had told her about. The visit was scheduled as an educational opportunity, giving the twins a chance to learn about royal history while allowing Charlotte to make friends with children her own age. When the day arrived, Charlotte was nervous but excited. She had been thinking about Emma and Sophie ever since Thomas first mentioned them. As the twins arrived with their father, Charlotte could see where they got their kind nature. The girls were polite but natural, not overwhelmed by meeting a princess but genuinely interested in getting to know her. During the tour, Charlotte found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did with visitors. Emma shared her love of reading, and they discovered they both enjoyed adventure stories about brave girls. Sophie had a wonderful sense of humor and made Charlotte laugh until her sides hurt. For the first time in months, Charlotte felt like she was just being herself rather than performing the role of a princess. Thomas watched the interaction between the three girls with satisfaction. He could see that Charlotte needed friends who would treat her normally, and his daughters were perfect for that. They were impressed by the palace and respectful of Charlotte's position, but they also teased her gently when she was being too formal, and included her naturally in their conversations. As the visit concluded, Catherine approached Thomas privately. "This has been wonderful for Charlotte," she said gratefully. "Would you and your family be interested in arranging more informal visits? Perhaps Emma and Sophie could come for tea occasionally, or Charlotte could visit your home sometime." Thomas was surprised but pleased by the suggestion. "My wife and I would be honored, Your Highness. The girls have talked about nothing but this visit since we planned it." From that day forward, Charlotte had something she had never experienced before: genuine friendships with children who knew her as a person first. Emma and Sophie became regular visitors to the palace, and occasionally Charlotte was allowed to visit their more modest home where she could play freely without worrying about breaking precious antiques or maintaining perfect posture. The friendship also benefited Emma and Sophie, who gained confidence from their connection to the royal family while learning about service and responsibility from their father's example. They understood that their friendship with Charlotte was special and not something to boast about, but rather a trust to be honored. Years later, when Charlotte faced new challenges and changes, she would remember that morning when she cried in the palace corridor, and a kind guard broke protocol to comfort her. She learned that day that asking for help was a sign of wisdom, not weakness, and that the most important rules were often about treating each other with kindness and compassion. Thomas continued his service at the palace for many more years, eventually becoming a senior guard whose opinion was valued and whose approach to balancing protocol with humanity became a model for others. His moment of choosing compassion over convention had created ripples that improved life for everyone in the palace. Community. The handkerchief Thomas had given Charlotte that day became a treasured keepsake that she kept in her jewelry box. Whenever she felt overwhelmed by her responsibilities or uncertain about the future, she would hold the simple piece of cloth and remember that she was never truly alone, and that kindness could come from the most unexpected places when it was needed most.